Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight, better off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight, won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me? What makes this happy face? Showing off, don't wanna have to wait tonight. Wait tonight, better off. I'm gonna find my way tonight. Wait tonight, won't you talk to me? I wanna heal your sorrow. Won't you talk to me? We'll make a new tomorrow. Won't you talk to me? What makes this happy face change?
Okay, good evening, everybody. Just as I was starting up, I realized I did not fix my captions as per usual, so bear with me just a minute. I'll go ahead and fix them real quick, and we will get started on this tonight's chapter. That should do it right there. Okay. Here we go then. And we are on chapter 9. Yeah, chapter 9 of The Problem of Slavery in Western Culture. Winner of the 67 Pulitzer Prize, David Bryan Davis. So yeah, of course, you all know if you've been watching, the type is so small I gotta wear cheaters. Yes, the eyes are getting a bit on in age, so I'm not, just my eyes are. So, anyway, let's jump into this one. Chapter 9, The Continuing Contradiction of Slavery, Emancipation, Intermixture, and Prejudice. And I believe this is a little bit shorter chapter because this is the end of the second part. So, yeah, it's 26 pages. So, the one last night was over 40. So, this should be fairly easy to get through tonight. All right. It is an incontestable fact that slaves in Latin America had more opportunities for manumission than did those in the British colonies or the United States. This acceptance of individual emancipation, coupled with a growing tolerance of racial diversity, probably helped Latin Americans to avoid the tragic hatreds, the malignant fears, and the unjust discriminations that followed the abolition of slavery in North America. When one looks at the striking contrast between American and Brazilian experience in the late 19th century and the 20th century, it is only natural to presume that attitudes towards race and freedom were always so sharply differentiated. On the other hand, it is theoretically possible that the divergence had less to do with the character of slavery in the two countries than with the economic and social structures which defined the relations between colored freemen and the dominant white society. Thus far, we have tried to show that throughout the Americas, Negro slavery presented more significant similarities than differences. To acknowledge that manumissions were more common in Cuba and Brazil than in the United States, and that in the former countries the descendants of slaves came to be integrated into the rest of society, does not necessarily mean that we must concede this central point. Unless the Latin American bondsman always had a reasonable chance of becoming free and of being accepted as an equal of the white man, and unless North Americans were always consistently opposed to the principles of manumission, refusing to grant the freedom even the most elemental rights and protections, the difference could well be more of degree than of kind. While we should avoid giving the erroneous impression that there were no national differences in racial prejudice and attitudes towards manumission, it is necessary to correct certain exaggerated but widely held beliefs concerning the expectations of the ordinary Negro slave in Latin America and North America. Getting off to a good strong start. The strongest evidence for a radical and fundamental difference regarding manumission is the restrictive legislation of the British West Indies and mainland colonies. From the late 17th century to the time of the American Revolution, virtually every British colony enacted laws which in some way limited the master's power to free his slaves. Sometimes he was merely required to provide security against the freed man's becoming a public burden. Sometimes he was obliged to prove that his slave, by meritorious service, deserved freedom. As early as 1691, Virginia anticipated the common 19th century policy of holding masters responsible for transporting manumitted slaves out of the state. Despite a tendency to liberalize these restrictions in the period immediately after the American Revolution, slaveholding states showed an unmistakable trend toward limiting the number of manumissions. By the mid-19th century, the American master who wished to free his slaves was forced to rely on legal ingenuity and subterfuge. And while the Code Noir placed no restrictions on emancipation, the French colonies followed a similar pattern of development. In Guadeloupe, no slave could be liberated without specific authorization from the government. A French ordinance of 1713 required masters in the Leeward Islands to have written permission from the governor general before manumitting a slave, and on occasion authorities in France went so far as to annul testamentary emancipations. In both British and French colonies, the chief motives behind such restrictions were the beliefs that free Negroes were an unassimilable element, and that they contributed to crime, prostitution, public disorder, and above all, discontent among the slaves. Since the Spanish and Portuguese colonies were generally free from such legal restraints, and at times even encouraged the manumission of slaves, it would appear that national attitudes toward race and the capacity for freedom were radically different even in colonial times. Yet we should not assume that restrictive laws tell the whole story. In every slaveholding colony and state there were considerable numbers of freed men, but only in parts of New England did private manumissions, aided by the actions of courts, lead progressively to the actual eradication of slavery. If national differences were as great as the laws suggest, there would have been few free Negroes in North America and few slaves in Cuba or Brazil. In order to gain a somewhat clearer picture of attitudes toward manumission, it is well to examine the means by which a slave could obtain liberty and the disabilities he might suffer as a freedman. From ancient times, judges and lawmakers had recognized that a man might be unjustly held in bondage, and that slaves should therefore be allowed the right to plead for freedom. And because servitude was often considered as a kind of merited punishment, it was recognized that a slave might win atonement by some extraordinary deed of loyalty or courage. In 1540, a Spanish law required the royal audiencias to hear the plea of any Negro claiming a right to freedom, and a similar provision was incorporated in a Spanish code in 1680. But the same principle was embodied in a South Carolina statute in 1712 and was accepted even by 19th century courts in American slaveholding states. Many Latin American slaves won their freedom as a result of military service, especially in the wars for independence. Yet this practice, which could rise from expediency as well as from a traditional sense of justice, was not confined to one region. In Virginia and Jamaica, for example, Negroes were officially awarded freedom for reporting slave conspiracies or for helping in the pursuit and capture of runaways. The Jamaican government supplemented the main reward with a badge which on one side read, quote, "Freedom for being honest," end quote, and the other, quote, "by the country," end quote. It was estimated that after the American Revolution, the number of free Negroes in Virginia doubled in the space of 2 years, partly as a result of manumissions for service in the war. Obviously, more slaves would benefit from this policy in regions where their military assistance was indispensable and where, once armed, they might determine the balance of power. In the American Revolution, unlike the wars for liberation in the Spanish colonies, it was not necessary to issue edicts of general emancipation in order to mobilize an adequate army, but the principle of using freedom to reward public service won widespread acceptance. A far more distinctive feature of Latin American slavery was the well-known provision allowing a bondsman to purchase his own freedom. Recalling the traditional links between slavery and sin, one is tempted to see in the gradual purchase of freedom some parallel with Catholic penances and indulgences, which were wholly alien to the Protestant mind. The custom, however, was not established in the French colonies, and as we shall discover, it was not unknown to the North American law of slavery. Its origins, development, and effectiveness in Latin America are also somewhat obscure. In the 1520s, there was a proposal apparently originating in New Spain that slaves should be permitted to pay a fixed sum to secure their freedom. The purpose of the plan was to reduce the danger of insurrection and to make Negroes more manageable, but it seems to have been without effect. Yet by the mid-18th century, the practice of coartación, I wish he'd translate some of these things, had long been established in Cuba, which up to that time had had a relatively small population of slaves. Under the system of coartación, a slave could make his master agree on a fixed price, which might be set through the arbitration of a local court or official, and the slave might then purchase his liberty in installments. After he had paid a certain portion of the total price, he could not be sold, though he might at his own will arrange to be transferred to a different master. The system varied in technical details from one period to another, and from one part of the island to another, and its success depended less on law than on the force of public opinion. It was often customary, for example, to regard a slave who had paid one half of his price as one half free, and accordingly entitled to one half of his time. But the law held that a master had an absolute right to all his slave's time until the last installment was paid. It is also worth noting that at least after 1789, coartación was not transmissible to children, so that a child born while a mother was purchasing her own freedom was still the absolute property of the mother's owner. In other words, the right of self-purchase was not allowed to infringe upon the concept of personal property, which was still the central element in defining status of the slave. The status of the slave. The practice of coartación seems to have spread from Cuba to other Spanish colonies, but there was considerable variation in its application. In New Granada, it was apparently not authorized by law until the late 18th century. The royal governor of Louisiana opposed its introduction to that province, claiming that what was proper for Cuba was not necessarily suitable for other Spanish possessions. What is most remarkable is that the Santo Domingo Code of 1785 allowed coartación, but placed severe restrictions on private manumissions. In the supposed interest of preventing robbery and other crimes, this law denied masters the unlimited power of liberating their Negroes. No slave could request his liberty unless he could give satisfactory proof of his good character and conduct. No master could accept payment for freedom from a Negro who could not prove that he had acquired the money by legitimate means. Furthermore, in order to manumit a slave, it was necessary to obtain a license from the government. Since this code was obviously designed to discipline and limit the size of the free Negro population, it would appear that coartación was regarded as an unusual transaction in which a master voluntarily agreed to sell liberty to a highly superior slave. In Brazil, even in the early colonial period, it was customary for some masters to free slaves upon payment of the original purchase price. There are records of Negroes acquiring gold from placer mining, and buying their freedom, and of organized brotherhoods, often religious in character, which pooled resources for the purpose of emancipation. But however beneficial the custom may have been for skilled laborers, we should not exaggerate its effectiveness in giving most slaves a realistic hope of freedom. Octavio Ianni has shown that in southern Brazil, masters sometimes relieved the tensions of slavery by granting special favors to domestic servants, yet manumissions could never be allowed to weaken a system that required absolute authority and submission. Until the late 19th century, emancipations in the South were not frequent enough to be socially or economically significant. As late as 1871, Brazilian reformers, aided by considerable diplomatic pressure from Great Britain, secured a law compelling masters to emancipate any slave who could pay his market price, a measure which would not have been thought necessary if the practice had been as universal as has been supposed. The so-called Rio Branco Law of 1871 also provided special taxes and a national lottery to pay for emancipations, and gave masters the option of accepting indemnification from the state for freeing all children born of slave mothers, or of enjoying the services of such children up to the age of 21. Yet slaveholders found so many ways of ignoring or evading the law that the reformers were forced to admit in a few years that it was totally unenforceable. The campaign of the radical abolitionist was based on the utter failure of such ameliorative measures. This suggests that earlier and much milder laws and customs were not particularly effective in forcing masters to part unwillingly with their slaves. Moreover, the reformers' ultimate triumph was not the result of a new national unity or of a gradual amelioration of slavery. Brazilian emancipation was made possible only by the growing militancy of urban industrialists, bureaucrats, engineers, and military officers, who saw the slave system as a primary obstacle to economic progress and who openly encouraged Negroes to desert the plantations and flee to the cities. If it is answered that the Brazilian courts at least upheld contracts for the purchase of freedom, the same can be said of certain courts in North America. In South Carolina, for example, a Negro woman named Sally was given permission by her master to live in town and work independently on the condition that she pay him a stipulated portion of her wages. Sally was industrious and succeeded in saving enough extra money to buy the freedom of her daughter. After being paid, however, the master refused to release the child, on the ground that any money earned by Sally was rightfully his. In 1792, the Chief Justice of the state ruled that the master had no claim to what Sally earned over and above the amount agreed upon, and that Sally had a perfect right to purchase her child's freedom. The jury found that Sally's daughter was free. One cannot dismiss this case as a product of liberalism still lingering from the Revolution. In 1828, a Virginia judge asserted that the laws of all civilized nations favored liberty, and quoted Ulpian, Ulpian, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, which shows that traditions of Roman law were not confined to Latin America. I'm going to butcher this. In obscura voluntate manumittentis favendum est libertati. Something in Latin about manumission and liberty. I don't know what it all means. In 1844, the highest court of the same state held that when a master agreed to manumit a slave on the condition that the slave serve for 6 years and pay a stipulated sum, the deed should be interpreted as an immediate emancipation, since in cases of doubt, the construction should be favorable to freedom. Tennessee courts repeatedly denied slave owners the right to break a contract with a slave for freedom, and recognized a status of quasi-servitude in which a Negro was no longer under the dominion of his master, but was not yet free under the laws of the state. In 1846, actually, before I do that, I have a comment. Going back to Sally and her daughter, the jury found that her daughter was free. And I just want to point out one little tiny insignificant fact. There wouldn't have been any black people on the jury. They wouldn't have been allowed to be on a jury. It would have been only white men. So keep that in mind. Okay, in 1846, a Kentucky judge made his astonishing declaration. Quote, "A slave is not in the condition of a horse. He is made after the image of the Creator. He has mental capacities and an immortal principle in his nature that constitute him equal to his own, but for the accidental position in which fortune has placed him. The law cannot extinguish his high-born nature, nor deprive him of many rights which are inherent in man. He can make a contract for his freedom, which our laws recognize, and he can take a bequest of his freedom, and by the same will he can take personal or real estate." End quote. If this doctrine seems utterly contrary to the statutes which defined the slave as chattel property and prohibited manumissions, it is because there was a very great difference between statute law and judicial interpretation. The whole tendency of statute law was to inhibit emancipations in the supposed interest of public safety and welfare, but this bias frequently clashed with the benevolent will of masters and with judicial precedent. In order to avoid overstating the point, let us emphasize that while thousands of North American Negroes were permitted to purchase their freedom, the practice was much more widely accepted in Latin America. But the legal principles and traditions were not so strikingly different as has been supposed. In North America, emancipation was sometimes deemed to be implied by certain acts of a master, such as abandoning a sick slave, giving a slave a legacy, or living in open concubinage with a female slave. The growing conflict between restrictive statutes and judicial precedent brought confusion and complexity to the law, especially with respect to wills. But even in the 19th century, American courts occasionally recognized a slave's right to promised freedom. One of the most troublesome questions was whether children born of a female slave who had been promised freedom were entitled to the same benefit. The will of Jonathan Pleasance, drawn in 1776, contained a strong indictment of slavery and ordered that whenever the laws of Virginia made it possible, his slaves and their offspring should be given absolute freedom at the age of 30. Quote, "which I desire they may enjoy in as full and ample a manner as if they had never been in bondage." End quote. In Pleasance versus Pleasance, 1799, it was not only decided that the slaves over the age of 30 should be free as a result of a law of 1782 authorizing manumission, but Judge Rowan advanced the opinion that since a mother under the age of 30 had a positive right to future freedom, her condition was that of a free person held to service for a term, and accordingly her children were born free and were beyond the power of the testator. This view, which was more liberal than the rule of coartación in Cuba, was repudiated in 1824 in the case of Maria versus Serba. Judge Green's opinion was based on the argument that if a promise to emancipate a female slave automatically freed children born during her remaining period of service, the owner could not be held responsible for supporting these children, and the burden would inevitably fall on the public. Other slaveholding states followed the precedent set by Maria versus Serba, and yet the Virginia Code of 1849 ruled that when a female slave had been emancipated by deed or will, her issue born between the recording of the deed or the death of the testator and the time of her actual manumission were to be considered free. And in Parks versus Hewlett, 1838, Henry St. George Tucker modified the judgment in Maria versus Serba by holding that creditors had no claim to either a woman or her children who had been emancipated after their owner had contracted a debt, and that any qualifications attached to a mother's emancipation could not carry over to her children. The law of slavery in the United States was filled with ambiguities and compromises, which resulted from an underlying assumption that, in the words of Henry St. George Tucker, quote, "emancipation is not strictly a gift of property. It is the exoneration of a human being from the bonds which our institutions have fastened upon him and which the beneficence of our times has authorized the master to remove." End quote. Increasingly, the fear of social and economic problems created by a growing class of free Negroes brought restrictive laws that implied that bondage was a permanent and unalterable condition. But a judicial bias in favor of freedom was never entirely extinguished. In order to safeguard testamentary manumissions, for instance, slave owners were generally permitted to specify in their wills that debts were to be discharged through the sale of real estate. In the absence of such an expression of intent, state law deferred regarding the effect of testamentary manumissions on the sale of property to satisfy claims. Nevertheless, if an executor wrongfully sold Negroes who had been emancipated by will when there were sufficient assets to pay all debts, the sale was invalid even though the purchaser had acted in good faith. When in 1844 a Virginia court was confronted by the conflicting wills of John Randolph, who had first provided for the emancipation of his hundreds of slaves, and had then revoked the gift, it was decided that his sudden change of heart was the result of insanity. Courts held that the status of a fugitive could not be inherited, and that children born of a slave mother after her flight to freedom could not be recovered. As late as 1836, a distinguished Virginia judge could proclaim with the assent of the entire court that, quote, a slave who is capable of nothing else is at least capable to take his freedom, and that the grant of it is just as susceptible of gradations in its progress to perfection as a bargain and sale of land. It is clear that not only will an inchoate and imperfect right to freedom in a slave be recognized, but even a modified quasi-state of freedom is sanctioned by this court, a state in which an emancipated female is held in unqualified slavery, yet is deemed capable of having free-born issue, a state therefore in which the party is half free, half slave, with the mingled rights of each state. End quote. With what differences there were in national attitudes toward manumission can partly be attributed to changing views on racial intermixture. White men had sexual intercourse with Negro bondwomen throughout the Americas, but such relations were naturally more common and acceptable in regions where there were relatively few white women. In colonial Brazil, the French West Indies, and even Barbados and Jamaica, planters and administrators met the need for female companionship, as well as for sexual gratification. By living openly with Negro mistresses who were often accorded many of the privileges of legitimate wives, the governors of the Spanish provinces, being forbidden to marry, had no compunctions about living with slave mistresses, and accordingly set an example for men of less exalted rank in Louisiana as well as South America. It was a universal judgment that the Portuguese, who had been the first to intermix with Negroes on the African coast, excelled all other people in their tolerance of racial blending. Let's see, was it 78 or 88? We're going to 88. Yeah. Okay. But no matter how much love and respect an individual master might feel for his slave concubine, it took centuries, even in Brazil, for the power of sex to dissolve the color line. As C.R. Boxer has bluntly said, quote, it did not follow from this readiness to mate with colored women that the Portuguese male had no racial prejudice, end quote. Nor did the long warfare between Portuguese and Moors result in a spirit of racial toleration. In colonial Brazil, so much prestige was attached to a relative whiteness of skin that Negro and mulatto mothers thought themselves blessed by fortune when their children's complexion appeared lighter than their own. As a popular Brazilian adage put it, quote, white women are for marriage, mulattoes for fornication, and negresses for work, end quote. Even in the mid-19th century, coffee planters in the Paraíba Valley treated Negroes as mere brutes whose marital ties deserved no respect, and mulatto children were often unrecognized by their fathers or persecuted by the planters' jealous wives. Nor was it an absence of racial consciousness that led the Spanish to devise an elaborate system which classed the child of a Negro and white as a mulatto, the term being derived apparently from the word for mule, and which supplied a complex terminology to describe every conceivable mixture of white and Negro blood. Throughout the Spanish colonies, authorities tried to prevent the cohabitation of Negroes and Indians. In Venezuela, 18th century laws flatly prohibited the marriage of whites and free Negroes. According to Richard Konetsky, the Spanish concern for purity of blood developed in the colonies into a widespread racial prejudice which found expression in the discriminatory laws. Yet for all their racial consciousness, the Spanish and Portuguese were distinctive in their final acceptance of the inevitability of intermixture. Latin American society increasingly took concubinage as a matter of course, and instead of concealing their liaisons, masters felt free to acknowledge their mistresses and to accord them special privileges. This fact, coupled with the view that each step toward whiteness was a progression in status, and each infusion of Negro blood a retrogression, made possible a slow assimilation which, in time, brought a relative tolerance of racial diversity. But in spite of the frequency of intermixture in the French, Dutch, and British colonies, the practice was severely condemned. If this suggests that social values were different from those in Latin America, it would be hazardous to base an explanation on a simple contrast between Catholic and Protestant cultures. A 17th century Catholic missionary expressing horror over sexual irregularities in the French West Indies showed that he was not merely troubled by the sin of fornication. Quote, "Our French colonists allow themselves to love their Negro slaves, in spite of their black faces which make them hideous and in spite of the stench they give off, two qualities which should, in my opinion, extinguish the ardor of their master's criminal passion." End quote. The Code Noir, to be sure, permitted a master to liberate and marry a female slave, but most French colonists considered Negroes fit only for illicit connections. In Louisiana, a law of 1724 forbade the marriage of whites and Negroes. In the West Indies, the French planter, who had sexual relations with a slave, faced the threat of fines and other penalties, and while French planters were deterred neither by law nor public opinion, they made some effort to conceal their illicit connections, and prided themselves on their superiority to the Spanish and Portuguese, who were lascivious without shame. An 18th century Jamaican judge was similarly contemptuous of the Latin Americans, but confessed that his own countrymen were all too prone to unite, quote, "two tinctures which nature has dissociated like oil and vinegar." End quote. The underlying cause, he felt, was not the shortage of white women, or the supposed burdens and expenses of marriage, but rather the sexual attractiveness of Negro women. Quote, "Many are the men of every rank, quality, and degree here who would much rather riot in these goatish embraces than share the pure and lawful bliss derived from the matrimonial mutual love." End quote. He hinted, as did other British and French writers, that the judgment of many planters had been warped by the influence of concubines who obtained jewels and riches as well as great privileges, and who had used their sexual charms to exhaust and finally kill their generous masters. In Maryland, 17th century legislators were particularly concerned by the fact that women servants of English origin enjoyed connections with Negro slaves, quote, "always to the satisfaction of their lascivious and lustful desires." End quote. Since the intermixture occurred in every colony regardless of laws and prejudice, it was essential to determine whether the ancient rule of partus sequitur ventrum applied to mulattoes. For a time, Maryland adopted a reverse standard in order to inhibit the quote-unquote lustful desires, of white women. But even when a child inherited his mother's status, it was only natural for a master to feel a sense of responsibility toward his own illegitimate children, especially if he had been living in intimate concubinage with their mother. The dilemma presented by this situation, which was a product of the universal contradiction of slavery, was much the same whether an owner lived under the laws of Britain, France, or Portugal. In Brazil and the Spanish colonies, the child of a slave mother inherited her status, but inasmuch as these societies accepted open concubinage, and slave mistresses often occupied positions of privilege and power, it is not surprising that mulatto children were often regarded as free. Prior to the Code Noir, French planters in Martinique customarily freed their mulatto children at the age of maturity. The Code Noir, however, made the rule of partus sequitur ventrum universal in the French West Indies, and also held that if an owner had a child by his own female slave, he was to be fined and the child removed to a poorhouse or asylum. All such children were to remain slaves for the rest of their lives. Notwithstanding this severe restriction, which was supplemented by an ordinance prohibiting the emancipation of children whose mothers were not definitely free, French planters continued to liberate their own mulatto children, who in time formed a significant element in the colonial populations. The Dutch planters of Suriname showed a similar inclination to spare their children from the burdens of servitude. But while free mulattoes came to form a large class in both Dutch and French colonies, they could not look forward to a steady progression toward the status of whites. Unlike the Spanish and Portuguese, the Dutch and French attached the stigma of slave descent to any man with the slightest trace of Negro ancestry. In Jamaica, on the other hand, a man was considered legally the same as a white if he was removed by more than 3 generations from a Negro ancestor. As late as 1835, a South Carolina judge argued that the problem should be dealt with in a flexible and pragmatic manner. Quote, "We cannot say that admixture will make a colored person the condition that the condition is not to be determined solely by visible mixture, but by reputation, and it may be proper that a man of worth should have the rank of a white man, while a vagabond of the same degree should be confined to the inferior caste." Okay. This statement, which shows that even Southern courts might sanction the passage from one caste to another, also reveals one of the distinguishing marks of slavery in North America. As Winthrop Jordan has pointed out, there were no gradations between the status of Negro and white. The mulatto did not occupy a halfway position, but was seen as essentially a Negro. This bias may well have been the result of a moral indignation at racial intermixture, which was more intense where large numbers of white women and a high valuation of marriage made illicit sexual relations less tolerable. Yet even here we run the risk of exaggerating. And actually, I just had a thought on that. If they were essentially Negro, is that why people who are very clearly not pure black, I don't even know what that necessarily means now, in America, why they always consider themselves black? Is that kind of a throwback to that kind of thinking that those groups are holding on to, even if the rest of us aren't? Just a thought. Um, Yet even here, we run the risk of exaggerating and oversimplifying national differences. Jamaicans borrowed the Spanish gradations of mulatto, sambo, quadroon, and mestiza, but their law regarded all these classes as mulatto. Edward Long, the Jamaican judge and historian, favored a law that would liberate every mulatto child, but Long was violently prejudiced against the mulatto class, and also advocated laws restricting the amount of real and personal estate that a white man could bequeath to a man of color. His That's interesting. He's using man of anyway. His motive for desiring the emancipation of mulatto children was to penalize masters who cohabitated with their female slaves. He would not have admired the Kentucky judge who said, with respect to a master's intention to free and marry his slave concubine, quote, "De gustibus non disputandum," end quote, whatever the hell that means, and who upheld the validity of the master's will involving the woman and her children. In North America, there were numerous cases of slave owners acknowledging and freeing their mulatto children, and such intentions were sanctioned by courts. While men and women of mixed ancestry were frequently kept in bondage, there were reports of such slaves being allowed to work for wages and of eventually passing as white freemen. Southern juries sometimes ruled that men who were visibly colored were legally white because of their character and reputation. in South Carolina as well as Jamaica, a few men with Negro blood in their veins rose to positions of power and prestige. But after every allowance is made for such flexibility, there can be little doubt that it was more likely for people of racially mixed ancestry to be emancipated and eventually to rise to the status of whites in Latin America than in the British colonies, and that it was similarly more likely in the British West Indies than in the mainland colonies and states. That this difference was largely the result of a willingness to accept the consequences of illicit sexual relations is suggested by a succession of 18th century petitions to the Jamaican Assembly. These petitions, which began in the early 18th century and became increasingly common, convey a general picture of aging planters surrounded by families of mulattoes and quadroons who, in the absence of legitimate families, were the only objects of their father's love and solicitude. It is perhaps significant that these planters, whose livelihood had rested on the labor of slaves in a bleak and often isolated environment, were particularly concerned with the fate of their colored grandchildren. One has the image of an austere master whose position and sense of shame had stiffened all relationships with concubines and even children, but whose quote-unquote parental bent, to use Veblen's phrase, was awakened by the sight of grandchildren, who may have reflected his features slightly tinted, but who were condemned because of his youthful passions to a life of perpetual inferiority. Hey, Nambro, how's it going? Good to see you in here. Thank you for coming in. Such masters were unmoved by the plight of slaves or by the degraded position of other mulattoes. Always one's own children or grandchildren deserved special consideration, for they were far superior to others of their class. They were of good character and had benefited from Christian training. John Clifford, having no legitimate family, wished to leave his fortune to his natural children and grandchildren, quote, which will enable them to support themselves in a manner far above others within their own degree. End quote. George Bedward complained that a law of 1761 to prevent quote unquote inconveniences arising from exorbitant devices to mulattoes kept him from bequeathing his estate and fortune to his natural grandson, a free quadroon, who was a fine, upstanding young man, and the Assembly was increasingly sympathetic to such pleas, since its members could comprehend the underlying motives. A succession of special acts granted to hundreds of mulattoes most of the rights and privileges of free-born Englishmen. Despite frequent condemnation of racial intermixture, legislators knew that the loneliness and isolation that made such relationships inevitable also made a man solicitous about the welfare of his own progeny. There was no need, as in the northern mainland colonies, to conceal the facts of life or to suppress life's emotions. Just real quick, I want to find those terms again. I have never seen most of those. I want to just mark them. Here it is on page 279. I've heard mulatto and sambo, but I've never heard quadroon and mestiza. Never heard those. Quadroon I can kind of figure out. It's a quarter. But mestiza I've never heard. Okay. I'm going to mark them so that I can look them up later and learn more about them. In referring to relations between the Portuguese and Negroes, C.R. Boxer has observed that one race cannot systematically enslave another for more than 3 centuries without acquiring feelings of racial superiority. But to see slavery as the only source of racial prejudice is to oversimplify one of the most complex and troublesome questions in modern history. In this study, we can hardly begin to consider such an enormous subject as the origins of racial prejudice. We need to note that there is evidence of such prejudice in 18th century Europe, where slavery could not have been a direct cause. The fact that Africans had traditionally been associated with Moorish infidelity and with Noah's curse of Canaan, uh, may have disposed some Europeans to regard them as fit for bondage. Our information is still highly fragmentary, but it is possible there was something in the culture of Western Europe that inclined white men to look with contempt on the physical and cultural traits of the African. Yet we should remember that European slave traders initially dealt as equals with African princes and merchants, and Negroes of royal blood who traveled to Europe were received with respect and honor. In many societies, moreover, the stigma of Slavish origin had been fastened on freedmen and their descendants, even when slavery was not racial in character. This was true, in fact, even among the West Africans. It would appear that racial differences reinforced their common tendency to attach some of the burdens and disabilities of slavery to the free offspring of slaves. In any event, for the purposes of this inquiry, it is sufficient to show that racial discrimination was coextensive with American Negro slavery, and that the divergence between British and Latin America in the treatment of the colored race was a slow and gradual phenomenon, and not the result of original differences in their systems of slavery and caste. Even a relative acceptance of racial blending did not mean an absence of racial prejudice. In time, racial prejudice was probably eroded in certain colonies by the militancy of mulattoes and quadroons who resented and struggled against the restraints which attached to their condition, but who could take pride in their white blood, which placed them in a position above the Negro. In North America, where mulattoes were generally classed as Negroes, the gate to equality was too heavy to force. But racial prejudice long persisted in Latin America, despite the frequency of intermixture. Uh, Spanish colonial law barred a free man of Negro descent from bearing arms, holding public office, entering craft guilds, appearing on the streets after dark, or associating with Indians. In the 17th century, the Viceroy of Peru prohibited Negroes, mulattoes, quadroons, and zambos, it says zambos with a Z instead of sambos with an S this time, from entering the university, and persons of Negro blood were similarly excluded from higher education in colonial Mexico. These disabilities were not of short duration. Jose Manuel Valdez, a Peruvian mulatto who was sent to his nation's Congress in 1831 and who received honors as a poet and physician, had been barred from the university in his youth, despite his light complexion and obvious intelligence. Until 1812, even the church refused to admit to orders men of Valdez's condition. His only access to the professions was through the practice of medical quackery. Men of Valdez's generation benefited from the impact of the European Enlightenment and from the ideals propagated by the War of Liberation. Earlier, free Negroes or mulattoes in the Spanish colonies had been required to live with an employer or be bound by contract to work in the fields or mines. In such colonies as Mexico, uh, as in the British provinces, the full force of the law was directed against the alleged danger of mulatto crime, disorder, and vagabondage. Even whites who intermarried with descendants of Negroes were subjected to the legal disabilities of the supposedly infamous class. Until the late 18th century, conditions were not essentially different in Brazil, where white men, thinking it degrading to work with their hands, repeated an ancient saying that, quote, work is for a cur or a nigger, end quote. Mulattoes in colonial Brazil suffered far more discrimination than did the Mamelucas and the Caboclos, who were the offspring of Indians and whites. They were prevented by law from carrying arms, wearing clothes inappropriate to their class, or taking official positions in church or state. Penal law for persons of Negro descent reflected a pervasive fear that men who were at once unemployed and barred from the most promising opportunities would resort to crime or rebellion. Hence the law threatened a mulatto found with a lethal weapon with 100 lashes. But as the free colored class increased in size and power and struggled for such symbols of prestige as the wearing of a sword, it became impossible to enforce discriminatory laws. By the late 18th century, this internal pressure was supplemented by the enlightened reforms of the Portuguese crown. Henry Coster, who visited Brazil early in the 19th century, found that mixed castes had gained in rights and status as a result of liberal laws. Even then, however, colored citizens were ineligible for some high offices, and there was a lingering of social prejudice. Jose Bonifacio, like Manuel Roca, were before him, found it necessary to argue that Negroes were true human beings. In 1839, a French immigrant, Charles Tawney, uh, published a Manuel do Agricultor Brasileiro, which maintained that Negroes were so inferior to whites that they were incapable of the responsibilities of freedom. For at least a generation more, this view was widely accepted among the slaveholders of the southern states and interior valleys. In southern Brazil, indeed, a racial ideology and unfavorable stereotypes of the Negro persisted well into the 20th century. Such prejudice was also strongly pronounced in the French West Indies, where it was official policy to regard slavery as an ineffaceable stain that contaminated a slave's entire posterity. When some free people of color asked the Superior Council of Saint Domingue to register their titles to nobility, as had been done for Indians who claimed descent from French lords, they were told that Indians were born free and always had a right to the privileges of freedom. Negroes, on the other hand, had been introduced to the colonies as slaves, and the brand could never be removed. The French justified harsh discriminatory laws by the theory that a debasement of the free colored population would ensure the subordination of slaves. Accordingly, persons of Negro descent were barred from holding office, carrying arms, taking the names of white men, or wearing clothing unbefitting their rank. If a free mulatto struck a white man, he was to be whipped, branded, and sold for the profit of the crown. Members of this degraded class were constantly threatened with re-enslavement, legal or otherwise, and were required at all times to be able to prove their title to liberty. The mulattoes of St. Domingo were persecuted and treated with severe brutality to the time of the French Revolution. Even then, the Provincial Assembly of the North, which supported the French National Assembly, sent a strongly worded protest against the Assembly's warm reception of mulatto delegates. In language similar to that of later South Carolinians, the French colonists demanded that the Assembly renounce any intention of interfering with slavery or the color line. Even a delay in such reassurance, they hinted, would strengthen motives for secession. But by 1790 there were enough mulattoes with education and wealth to thwart such efforts to combine revolution with a preservation of racial inequality. The role of mulatto officers and soldiers in the St. Domingue Revolution may well have contributed to a tightening of restrictions in North America. In colonial Virginia, free Negroes had been entitled to jury trial and bail on criminal charges and had been little restricted in movement or activity. When the British Board of Trade questioned a Virginia Act of 1723 depriving free Negroes of suffrage, Lieutenant Governor William Gooch did not defend the law on the basis of alleged racial differences, but argued instead that most free Negroes were, quote, the bastards of some of the worst of our imported servants and convicts, end quote, and that they were a dangerous influence on the slaves. It was therefore well, quote, to preserve a decent distinction between them and their betters, until time and education has changed the indication of their spurious extraction and made some alteration in their morals, end quote. But by 1800 such expectations seem to have vanished, for Virginia now required the registration of free Negroes and mulattoes, and a few years later ruled that an emancipated slave would forfeit his freedom if he remained in the state for more than a year without obtaining a certificate of good character, indicating that he was regularly employed and settled in a given county. We cannot begin to consider why legal discriminations increased in the United States and gradually disappeared in the West Indies and Latin America. It is surely of the utmost significance that free Negroes in the southern United States were subjected to the harshest restrictions at precisely the time when Jamaica and Barbados were removing legal disabilities from their free colored populations. In the British West Indies, as well as in Brazil, free Negroes had achieved legal equality before the enactment of general emancipation. This progress may not have hastened the end of slavery, but it certainly had a profound effect on the consequences of abolition. Well before the Civil War, the entire society of the United States became permeated with a deep racial prejudice that far exceeded that of any other nation in the New World. There is considerable evidence that this growing fear and scorn of the Negro was a product of what has vaguely been termed, quote, Jacksonian democracy and, quote, the rise of the common man, end quote. For our purposes, however, the important point is that the disabilities suffered by freed men and their descendants were roughly similar to most American colonies before the Age of Revolution. In Dutch Suriname, as well as in Brazil, New York, and St. Domingue, it was sometimes said that the condition of free Negroes was worse than that of slaves. Colonial New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania prohibited free Negroes from holding real estate in their own right. After 1702, they could not be freeholders in the British Leeward Islands, and if any Negro or mulatto acquired more than 8 acres of land, the quote-unquote overplus was to be sold within 6 months or be forfeited to the crown. Virginia law permitted free Negroes to own real and personal property, including slaves, to the time of the Civil War. But in most British colonies, colored men were legally barred from civil and ecclesiastical office and could not appear as witnesses against whites in criminal cases. In Jamaica, according to Brian Edwards, the lowest white man considered himself infinitely superior to the richest and most educated man of color. Even Pennsylvania legislators voted for the enslavement of any free Negro found living in marriage with a white, and referred to the entire class as quote, an idle, slothful people who often prove burthensome, burthensome. I imagine that's a misspelling from way back then of burdensome to the neighborhood, and afford ill examples to other Negroes, end quote. And if in practice free Negroes and mulattoes were frequently allowed to own property, make and enforce contracts, and testify in court against men of their own race, the statutes of British colonies were filled with police regulations restricting their movement, employment, and possession of arms, dogs, and liquor. Prevented them from having dogs? Okay. The grim and overriding fact is that in every colony, free Negroes and mulattoes suffered from legal and social discrimination and were at once condemned for idleness and prevented from enjoying economic opportunity, accused of being disorderly and deprived of equal justice. Variations in detail and terminology are less impressive when we learn, for example, that even in colonial Brazil, free mulattoes were often legally associated with slaves. This uniform discrimination must have been related to a fairly uniform conception of slavery as a state of absolute subjection and degradation. Like sovereignty, which more than liberty was in its polar opposite, slavery could be circumscribed and its limits set by law and custom. In most colonies, courts made efforts to recognize the basic humanity of slaves, but within the encircling limits and modifications which varied from region to region, the hard core of slavery was much the same. As with sovereignty, there was a resistant indivisible element that could not be changed without destroying the condition itself, and even when a slave was emancipated, his previous subjugation had been so extreme that he carried the mark of permanent degradation. A king does not lose his aura of privilege with abdication, and no difference in complexion distinguishes kings from other men. And that is the end of that chapter and the end of part 2 of the book. We will start in on part 3 on Thursday, chapter 10, which is religious sources of anti-slavery thought, Quakers, and the sectarian tradition. So we will pick that up Thursday. I am going to skip gaming tonight because I have been dragging butt all day, and I need to get my butt in bed earlier tonight. So, 332. I'm just seeing how long this next chapter is going to be. 291 to 332. It's going to be a long one. 42 pages. So this last one was 28. So, yep, it'll be a fairly long read on Thursday, but that's okay. Hopefully I will have gotten a little extra sleep between now and then. And not in short naps, but actual blocks. So, anyway, that is it. I'm going to see if there's anybody to raid. So please stick around just a couple of minutes, and we'll see what we see. And wherever we end up, I will see you over there. Looks like we've got Magi RPG playing tabletop RPGs, Mr. Blitzer playing The Witcher 3, Ren Flames playing Dying Light 2. He's been pretty cool lately. Well, he's always pretty cool, but I mean, anyway. He changed his name, though. Let's go to Ren Flames. Why not? The other ones are playing Dead by Daylight. I have no interest in that whatsoever. I will see you over there.